Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into one of the absolute most critical and honestly most complex geopolitical events of 2026. We're looking closely at the incredibly fragile June 2026 US-Iran agreement and the massive shipping crisis that it triggered. If you really want to understand the forces pulling the strings on global trade, energy prices, and international diplomacy right now, well, we have to look at the Middle East. Okay, let's start with a really stark geographical reality. 21. That's it, just 21 miles across at its narrowest point. That is the Strait of Hormuz. It's his tiny single maritime corridor, and yet it is literally holding the entire global economy hostage. A staggering percentage of the world's oil flows right through this exact choke point. So when traffic stops here, there's no escaping it. The ripple effects hit every single market, every gas pump, and every supply chain on the planet.
So how did we get to this boiling point? Let's walk through this high-stakes timeline because it all unfolded over just a few crazy days in mid-June. On June 17th, this historic Memorandum of Understanding, the MoU, was signed between the US and Iran. But then, almost immediately, between the 18th and 19th, fierce clashes erupted in Lebanon between the Israel Defense Forces and Hezbollah. It literally threatened to derail the whole thing overnight. Fast forward to June 21st, and U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance is touching down in Switzerland for emergency 11th-hour talks to try and salvage the deal. It just goes to show how incredibly fast and volatile these regional triggers are.
Right, so we really need to understand the agreement at the center of this whole storm. This US-Iran MoU was brokered by the Trump administration with a very clear twofold intention: halt the expanding regional conflict and reopen the Strait of Hormuz to commercial shipping. Simple enough, right? And globally, the initial reaction was a huge sigh of relief. I mean, G7 leaders even put out a statement praising it as a historic opportunity to stop nuclear proliferation and finally stabilize the Middle East. It was pitched as a massive diplomatic breakthrough.
But that relief? Yeah, it didn't last long. The agreement instantly sparked a severe diplomatic crisis. Israel expressed deep anger over this bilateral deal, basically feeling completely blindsided by their closest ally. We saw massive public protests erupt in the streets of Tel Aviv, with regular citizens and top government officials openly talking about a profound sense of betrayal. And that anxiety really stems from a genuine fear that the deal compromises Israeli security just to get a quick fix for global shipping lanes and U.S. economic interests.
You know, it's wild how just one phrase can create a complete deadlock. The MoU explicitly calls for a ceasefire on all fronts, including Lebanon. But the two sides are reading that entirely differently. Iran interprets ceasefire as a strict requirement for Israeli forces to totally withdraw from Lebanese territory. Israel, on the flip side, maintains its absolute right to self-defense, and the IDF actually continued striking Hezbollah targets after deadly attacks on their soldiers. So now, Iran is digging in, tying any future progress, even the nuclear talks, to this demand for an Israeli withdrawal. It's a massive, high-stakes standoff over the very definition of the agreement.
All right, let's step away from the negotiating table and look at the reality out on the water. Because while the diplomats argue, the situation at sea is critical. The G7 leaders have drawn a very hard line here. They stated, and I quote, "The right of transit passage without restrictions or tolls is the bedrock of international trade." They are unified on this. They're demanding a return to the pre-conflict status quo, where the Strait of Hormuz is universally recognized as an open, international waterway that's absolutely vital for global commerce.
Meanwhile, Iran is projecting a totally different narrative. The Persian Gulf Straits Authority, which operates under Iranian control, just dropped a list of new demands. They're essentially saying, sure, the strait is open, but it's open under our rules. They now require commercial vessels to submit transit requests, stick to very specific assigned routes, and, most controversially, carry what they are calling related Iranian insurance. Now, they did waive some of the fees for a 60-day negotiation window, but make no mistake, this is a very clear flex of Iranian sovereignty and control over the choke point. It's a direct challenge to the G7's demands.
And the physical danger for these crews right now? It is severe. The old route, the standard international traffic lanes that ships have safely navigated for decades, is currently incredibly dangerous because of naval mines. It's basically a no-go zone. Because of that, merchant ships are literally being forced into a massive detour. They have to take a new southern transit route that tightly hugs Omani territorial waters just to survive the passage. As you can imagine, this forced detour has created a highly militarized reality in the Gulf. These merchant ships aren't just quietly diverting south, they are moving under heavy, heavy guard. We're talking about a joint naval task force of French and British warships actively providing armed escorts for commercial vessels. The threat level is so high right now that back in London, the UK Parliament actually fast-tracked an emergency armed forces bill. This legislation is specifically designed to give defense personnel emergency powers to detect and shoot down hostile drones that are threatening this critical shipping lane.
Okay, let's add another layer to this geopolitical puzzle, because recent intelligence is pointing to some serious shadow diplomacy. According to multiple sources, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, has been busy forming completely new, covert Iraqi militia cells. The really significant part, these new cells report directly to the IRGC, entirely bypassing the usual Iraqi proxy groups. It's a calculated move. It lets Iran keep intense pressure on Gulf nations that host U.S. forces while at the exact same time maintaining plausible deniability. It's classic shadow play meant to dial up their leverage.
So, what is the bottom line for the global economy? Let's break down this sort of macroeconomic paradox we're seeing. Short term, the signing of the MOUs actually caused an initial drop in global crude prices. The International Energy Agency even put out a forecast suggesting a potential oil glut by 2027 if the peace holds. But the long-term reality is a whole lot darker. Energy experts and the oil industry have had this stark wake-up call. The underlying volatility isn't gone. The risk of the Strait of Hormuz closing isn't just a scary headline anymore. It is now permanently priced in as a baseline risk for global trade.
And because those economic stakes are literally sky high, the center of gravity has shifted away from the waters of the Gulf and straight into the diplomatic arena in Lucerne, Switzerland. This diplomatic stage is where the fate of that 21-mile choke point and, honestly, the stability of the entire global economy is going to be decided. These are incredibly high-stakes technical talks, trying to figure out if the lofty promises made in the MOU can actually survive in the real world.
You really just have to look at the guest list to understand how serious this is. You've got U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance leading the American delegation. But interestingly, you also have U.S. envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner there. They originally negotiated the MOU, but they took some heat for lacking specific nuclear expertise. And that is exactly why IAEA Chief Rafael Grossi being there is so absolutely crucial. He brings the heavy-hitting international nuclear oversight that's required. Add in Qatari mediators and the Prime Minister of Pakistan, and you start to see the massive global effort it took just to get all these parties sitting at the same table.
Which really brings us to the ultimate question we have to ask ourselves. Will this incredibly fragile memorandum actually hold together long enough to forge a real, lasting peace? Or are all these conflicting definitions, these heavily militarized shipping lanes, and the angry diplomatic protests just the prelude to a much, much wider global economic crisis? Honestly, the next few weeks in Switzerland are going to give us the answer. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning the headlines and definitely dig deeper into the facts we talked about today to really grasp the profound shifts happening in our world right now.